Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 365. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. Happy to have you on today. We got some Iran news to talk about, some Russian news to talk about, and we are holding a fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute, which is, why we get to do this show and all the writing that we put together. So if everybody could head on over to the Libertarian
Hey, you all,
Institute.
it's fundraising time again at the Libertarian Institute. We try not to do this to you too often, but business is business after all. I got a great group of guys and a gal at the Institute, and I got to pay them. So just go to libertarianinstitute.org/donate to pick your price and help out. We've got some great kickbacks too, books and shirts. Great ones. That's libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And thank you all very much.
All right, Connor, with that, let's go ahead and get into the show. We got a lot of articles today from the Libertarian Institute. The first one, Twitter gave boost to Pentagon PsyOps accounts. And I wrote this with Will Porter on December 20th. Twitter placed dozens of accounts created by U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, on a whitelist for preferential treatment, according to internal company documents obtained by journalist Lee Fang. The 8th iteration of the Twitter files exposed the site's involvement in propaganda operations run by the Pentagon. And Connor, I'm sure listeners remember, I think it was just the last episode of the show, I broke down a lot of what I thought were the highlights of the Twitter files, although I think this may be so far the biggest story that we got. A lot of the other stuff, like I said, was expected. Maybe the level of the FBI influence was surprising, but the fact that, CENTCOM is just able to send an email to Twitter as they did in 2017, requesting special privileges for 52 accounts. And these are all Arabic language accounts. And so it'd be kind of obvious that, this really isn't aimed at the American people, but aimed at, influence overseas. And so what Fane says happened is that after the email was sent, the social media platform quickly agreed and placed the accounts on the whitelist, which, according to Fang, essentially provided verification status to the accounts without the blue check, meaning they are exempt from abuse and spam flags and more visible and likely to be trending on hashtags. And, without the most of these accounts didn't disclose their relationship with the government, and also, not having that verified account, it probably just seems like a very general grassroots narrative coming up in the Arabic language, when in reality it's a very destructive psyops waged by the U.S. government. Some of the things that have been promoted here are the war in Yemen and also pushing criticisms of Iran. Another handle was seen as asserting that accurate U.S. drone strikes only kill terrorists, which, of course, Connor, we hear no, definitely not to be true. And so, Twitter, here, was allowing itself to push fake news that promoted war and violence for, people across a very wide stretch of this planet. And this was accepted policy at Twitter. And I think this is before Musk's takeover, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of this is still going on. Fang pointed out that accounts were in violation of Twitter's own policies, as the company executives had previously told lawmakers that they would rapidly identify and shut down all state-backed covert information operations and deceptive propaganda. Apparently, what went unsaid here and what is now coming out through Lee Fang reporting is, that really only applies to the rest of the world and countries we don't like. Any country we do like, the U.S., they could use the platform to push whatever kind of propaganda they want. Now, one more quick story, Connor, before we get into the news on Russia today. U.S. sends nuclear-capable bombers, stealth jets, to South Korea. Some of America's most advanced military aircraft conducted drills in South Korea on Tuesday as a show of force against North Korea. Pyongyang recently announced that it made the advancements towards deploying a surveillance satellite. The U.S. B-52s and F-22s took part in a new round of war games in the skies over the Korean Peninsula, joined by South Korean F-35s and F-16s. The B-52 is capable of carrying nuclear weapons and has long served as one of Washington's primary strategic bombers. The joint military exercises came soon after the DPRK carried out a test of its newly developed spy satellite, which is among a range of military technology Pyongyang has vowed to produce to better counter the United States. Throughout 2022, Washington, Seoul, and Pyongyang have engaged in a series of escalatory actions. North Korea has conducted a record number of missile tests, including multiple intercontinental ballistic missile launches, and fired projectiles, at least one projectile, over Japanese territory. U.S. officials, among them Vice President Kamala Harris, have repeatedly threatened to use nuclear weapons against North Korea and increase deployments of strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula to carry out. In South Korea and the U.S. regularly carry out large-scale live-fire war games, including the largest aerial military drills ever conducted between the two countries. Additionally, the U.S. and South Korea have entered into a trilateral defense agreement with Japan, largely looking towards Pyongyang and Beijing. The North has denounced the security pact, suggesting the United States intended to create a NATO-like alliance in the Pacific. The heightened military tensions in 2022 are a break from the previous 4 years. Starting in the second half of the Donald Trump administration, Washington and Seoul scaled back their military activity and opened up a dialogue with Pyongyang, ultimately netting a drastic reduction in war games and weapon tests on all sides. However, the Joe Biden White House has broken with the policy of engagement, almost entirely favoring military action over diplomacy. All right, move on now and talk about some news dealing with the war in Ukraine. And obviously, the most significant development is Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky traveling to the United States, being with Biden and addressing Congress. And so Dave DeCamp writes this for antiwar.com on December 21st. The Ukrainian president visited D.C. on Wednesday and met with Biden and addressed the Congress, which marked his first foreign visit since Russia invaded on February 24th. In his address to Congress, Zelensky thanked the chamber and the United States for its support, but mentioned that Ukraine doesn't have enough artillery. His visit came after Congress unveiled a new $1.7 trillion omnibus bill that includes another $45 billion in Ukraine aid, which will bring total U.S. spending on the war to $112 billion, $112 billion. And Connor, I know as of this morning, there was some dispute if this bill would get passed. I think it has to be passed by Friday, the 23rd at midnight to avoid a government shutdown. So I'm sure it will. There was some issues, and I think they have been worked out, actually. And so Congress is going to move forward with passing this likely today. That is December 22nd. Zelensky said, "We have artillery, yes, thank you. We have it. Is it enough? Honestly, not really," he said. And then he would tell Congress Ukraine is grateful for their support, but it's not enough. It's a hint it's not enough. Zelensky also suggested that the U.S. should give Ukraine more advanced military equipment that the Biden administration has yet to provide. Ukrainian soldiers can perfectly operate American tanks and planes themselves, he said. The Ukrainian leader portrayed Russia as a global threat that must be stopped and promised there would be a Ukrainian victory. Zelensky insisted that U.S. support for Ukraine is not charity, but an investment in global security and democracy. And Connor, I've seen a lot of this kind of rhetoric, particularly this past week, where, people are talking about we need to stop Russia to save the world. I think I saw this actually in a tweet from Jennifer Rubin, who put out, if we don't stop Russia, they're going to take over the world, and it'll be the end of the world. I mean, this is absurdly hyperbolic rhetoric that doesn't even make sense, and more likely pushes the world towards its fate of nuclear holocaust. So Representative Thomas Massie was one of the few members of Congress against arming Ukraine, agreed that aid to Ukraine wasn't charity. It's not charity. Charity wouldn't be given freely. The American taxpayer had been conscripted into making welfare payments to the foreign government, Massie wrote on Twitter. Earlier in the day, Zelensky held a joint press conference with Joe Biden after a closed-door meeting. Biden said Zelensky is open to pursuing a just peace, signaling that the Ukrainian leader was open to negotiations with Moscow. But later, when asked what his vision of a just peace would be, Zelensky said it means no compromises from Kiev. For me, as a president, Just peace means no compromises as to the sovereignty, freedom, territorial integrity of my country, the payback for all the damages inflicted by Russian aggression. He said there can't be any just peace in a war that was imposed on us, inhumans, I would say. And, Connor, this is really problematic. If this war is to end, there is going to have to be some kind of compromise. And the Ukrainians are openly saying now that, they're not going to do that at all. And then I think it was Emma Ashford who pointed out on Twitter that the one thing that this visit really does signal is that this war is going to go on for a long time. They're already planning to pass another $45 billion or so in aid for Ukraine, Connor. So why have Zelensky come visit and ask for even more? Well, it's because, they're planning on this taking a very long time. I think Dave said at the rate they spend this money, it likely that the current omnibus $45 billion will only make it till about April. So want to move on and mention this article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute yesterday, December 21st. Morocco to sell U.S. over 100 tanks for Ukraine after secret negotiations. The U.S. and the Netherlands are set to buy dozens of T-72 tanks from Morocco and then forward the weapons onto Ukraine in a deal negotiated in secret between Washington and Rabat. Notably, the move marks a deviation from Morocco's neutral stance towards the conflict with Russia. Under the agreement, the U.S. and the Netherlands will buy 90 T-72B main battle tanks for $95 million, and there is an option to add 30 tanks to the sale next year. Morocco will provide spare parts, and the tanks will be upgraded by Excalibur, a Czech military contractor. Though Morocco owns the vehicles, at least some are already undergoing upgrades in the Czech Republic. The first 5 tanks will be sent out next week, while Excalibur plans to ship up to 18 T-72s by the end of the year, according to the company's commercial director, Richard Kubina. The Czech Ministry of Defense confirmed the sale in a statement. Morocco will become the first African nation to provide weapons to Kiev, but it was previously hesitant to support any side in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In March, Morocco abstained from a UN vote that condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, according to reports by Military Africa and the Center for European Policy Analysts, CEPA. The U.S. has played a role in facilitating the T-72 agreement, though Morocco is yet to confirm the transfer. Morocco buys 91% of its arms from American suppliers, and Washington is a key backer of Rabat's claims over Western Sahara, where there is some 500,000 people who currently live under Moroccan military occupation. Morocco's claim to the disputed region has caused friction with its neighbor Algeria. Rabat believes Algiers has strengthened its ties with Moscow in recent months and has reportedly agreed to sell tanks bound for Ukraine as a way to spite Russia. And Connor, of course, this all also ties in with the Abraham's Accords in Israel, where Morocco is one of those countries to join those accords. And part of that was American recognition of its occupation of Western Sahara. So next story here, Moscow says U.S. policies have put U.S. and Russia on brink of direct clash. And this is, what we've been saying on the show for quite some time, but the Kremlin coming right out and saying it I think is a warning, Connor, and a way to try to, push the U.S. to say how important talks are right now. But I doubt we're going to see any response. This from Dave DeCamp. Russia defense minister plans to increase size of military. The Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, on Wednesday unveiled a plan to increase the size of Russia's military to up to 1.5 million troops, an initiative backed by Russian President Vladimir Putin. And I'm sure this is kind of a result of how, the geopolitics work in the world right now. Connor, other than Zelensky's visit, maybe the most significant article I have to talk about today, no evidence Russia was behind Nord Stream sabotage. After months of investigations into the sabotage of the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines that connect Russia to Germany, no evidence has been found linking Russia to the attack, the Washington Post reported on Wednesday, citing interviews with 23 diplomats and intelligence officials from 9 countries. There is still no evidence at this point that Russia was behind the sabotage, one European official said, Some Western officials were quick to blame Russia for the September attacks, but the report said some officials now say Russia is not to blame. And, this is what we thought from the beginning here, Connor. We never on this show point the finger at Russia. Of course, if somebody had presented evidence that Russia would have done it, I mean, this is a government and that's waging an aggressive war. And so it wouldn't be a huge surprise. But at the same time, when you look at the economic incentives and who benefits from doing this, it's clearly not Moscow. Now, I haven't jumped on the, bandwagon and just said, oh, it was carried out by Washington. I think there's a lot of reasons that Washington wouldn't have carried out a move like that, including they already were able to bring the pipeline to a standstill. And for again, I'm not a big guy on pushing the climate change narrative. However, the White House really does believe that, and blowing up pipelines isn't necessarily a green move. And so, these kind of things make at least the claim that was the U.S. to be problematic. Not that I'm, of course, unwilling to believe it. I don't think the best of Joe Biden or anything like that. So I kind of look more towards the UK. Remember, this was the short period of time where Liz Truss was the prime minister of the country. One last story, I believe, last story here on Russia. Turkey says Sweden blocking extradition of journalists is very negative. And so as Ankara is trying to get everything it can in exchange for consenting to Finland and Sweden joining NATO, they're pushing for even the release of Kurdish journalists, the extradition of Kurdish journalists to Turkey, where they're going to likely face some human rights abuses. I wouldn't be surprised, Connor, if this ends up going the way of Turkey and Sweden is willing to make the deal to get into NATO. As I usually say, a lot of times the Kurds end up paying the price for empire. And while a war in Europe doesn't seem like it would have any Kurdish casualties, I think we're actually going to start to see that. Now, Connor, I want to turn it over to you. And I know you got some news on Iran, but I first want to mention your article here that you wrote for the Libertarian Institute last week. That was absolutely fantastic. Washington erases red lines, escalates proxy war with Russia. So go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really talking about this crazy development we've seen in the beginning of this month. On December 5th and 6th, there were 3 attacks, drone strikes with Soviet-era drones on 3 Russian airfields. And they targeted nuclear-capable strategic bombers. I believe 3 Russian soldiers were killed. The 2 of the bombers were damaged, and then there was an oil tanker that was also damaged. And what was worse about that was a few days later, there was a report in the Times of London where they cited a U.S. Pentagon source, a U.S. defense source, who was saying that, we're giving Kiev the green light for more attacks like this. And not only that, we're going to consider providing them long-range missiles, fighter bombers, and rockets that were previously off the table, because the more Ukraine attacks deep inside Russia, these attacks were, so the furthest one of them was close to 400 miles inside the Russian mainland. It's extremely unprecedented so far in the war. And there have been attacks throughout the war from Ukraine launched against the Russian mainland, but much of them have been constricted to, closer to the shared border, attacking particularly the oblast of Belgorod, attacking, villages and oil depots and residential areas. These are helicopter and drone attacks usually. And then, of course, we know there was the assassination of Daria Dugina outside Moscow and the car bombing. But this is way, worse than that, frankly, because this really escalates tensions. There could have been a major accident at that airfield. There were reports in the Asia Times that suggested that, U.S. satellite GPS data may have been used, downlinked for the drones to be guided, because the drones that they're talking about, I forget the exact name, but they were manufactured in the 70s, and from what I understand, the internal guidance system is not, or it's not competent to carry out an attack like this. And there were also reports about Ukrainian forces being behind enemy lines over there in Russia, helping to direct and guide the drones. But nevertheless, we heard this defense official say that basically we give these attacks our tacit endorsement. We'd like to see more of them because, frankly, all the only real cost here is that there's this massive conventional bombing, strategic bombing campaign against civilian targets in Ukraine, wiping out the power grid, decimating the power grid, leaving millions and millions of Ukrainians without water, heat, and electricity in the freezing cold winter. That doesn't seem to matter so much to the Pentagon. They're more interested in, like I say here, erasing red lines and escalating the war. And I also mentioned this piece from the New York Times that came out a few weeks ago, maybe a month back now. But it's about how they're looking at Ukraine as this testing ground for weapons, and how it's really helping Western allies fine-tune our systems and our military tech for future wars, including with China. And I mentioned that quote from the head of Stratcom, who recently said that, yeah, Ukraine, this is just a warm-up. We're getting ready for the big one, which is, of course, is China. And that's the way they're talking about this in the New York Times. There's even, I think, a former Lithuanian president who says, I'm sorry to say that the Ukrainians are paying the price here, but we're learning a lot from all of this, and we're gaining quite a bit of knowledge and expertise here that we can use against other enemies in future wars. And so the real thing here is that we really don't see any signs of de-escalation. I mean, there's no political representation for anybody in this country who wants this to stop. I make the point that the Republican opposition, such as it is, Michael McFaul and people like this, they're criticizing Biden for not providing longer range weapons to attack Crimea more than the Ukrainians already are. And of course, the attacks, not just on these ammunition depots and airfields on the Crimean Peninsula earlier in the war, but particularly on the Kerch Bridge, the truck bombing, which was celebrated by the mainstream press out here, that is what actually provoked, after months and months and months. I mean, usually when America or its allies, the Saudis in Yemen, American Gulf War I, when America and its allies go into these sort of situations, they bomb the sewage, the electricity, the waterworks, the civilian infrastructure, transportation, oil refineries. They do all that immediately. Communications. The Russians did not do that until October, after this truck bombing. And that's not to justify it, but it's to say that U.S. policy is what caused this much worse crisis for the people of Ukraine, who are bearing the brunt of this proxy war strategy. And, there's all this talk about how the Republicans are going to be against, providing Ukraine just a blank check. And they say that they want more oversight. But of course, that's being used to justify sending more troops into the country to conduct these on-site weapons inspections. And at the end of the day, there's just, Mitch McConnell just came out and just praised to high heaven the new omnibus bill, which is $1.7 trillion. Merry Christmas, everybody. It includes $858 billion for the National Defense Authorization Act. And that's well over $800 billion, which is the nominal defense budget. And Robert Higgs's rule of thumb is you multiply that by 2 to see the real national security budget. When you include, the Energy Department, the VA, the interest in on all the prior war spending, not to mention the Department of Homeland Security and the intelligence agencies and all the other ancillaries. And they just, like you said earlier, they just passed, or Biden's going to get ready to sign, or they're going to get ready to pass here to prevent a government shutdown tomorrow night, this $45 billion in additional funding for Ukraine, just pouring gasoline on the fire. Going to get many more people killed. And that's the whole point of Zelensky coming down there and calling the Russians inhumans and getting everybody all juiced up on this. I saw Matt Gaetz make a point about how, it's okay for Zelensky to put his country first, but we've got to put our country first. And I don't really see it that way. It looks to me like, in the same way that Biden and Blinken are putting Lockheed and Austin are putting Raytheon and Lockheed first. Seems to me that's what Zelensky's doing. I mean, his people are dying, and of course they're not allowing fighting age males, which are basically anybody from 18 to the 60s. They're banned from leaving the country, and we're shipping them off to Germany and England and other places in Europe to be trained up and to learn how to. I'll never forget this quote from the British training program that they started, where they were trying to get 10,000 troops trained in a rudimentary infantry course in 120 days. And one of the quotes from the commanders overseeing this said, well, we're teaching them how to shoot well. It's absolutely devastating. And but yeah, I mean, the argument here, which is really dangerous, is, of course, that they're saying, since a NATO member state has not been attacked, and because Putin has not yet dropped a tactical nuclear weapon, that they're going to go ahead and encourage further attacks and green light these attacks. We're already seeing more. I mean, there was more shelling in Belgorod over the weekend. One contractor working on a poultry farm was killed. 8 other people were wounded. And then the Russian Defense Ministry said on Monday that they had intercepted these 4 anti-radar missiles that we've been sending Ukraine, I believe, since October. And so that just goes to show that this is not just, hyperbolic rhetoric from some anonymous source in the Times of London from the Pentagon. This is actually, I mean, we can see with our own eyes that the Ukrainians are really taking this to heart, and that we're going to see further and further escalations here. And yeah, I mean, even Stoltenberg is saying that we're at the brink of the war, spilling over the borders and into NATO territory, and there being there's a real possibility, I believe he said, of a full-blown war between NATO and Russia, where we could all die here in nuclear war. And he says, but we have to stay committed, and that's the mentality of the entire foreign policy blob. And this Zelensky trip really just puts it's just the coup de grace in all of this. Man, it's just absolutely devastating. So we'll have to see. And I make a point here at the very end that, really at the end of the day, we don't have any representation. Certainly the left doesn't. If you look at capitulators and hawks in sheep's clothing like Bernie Sanders, not to mention the cowardly progressive congressional caucus who retracted their letter and then blamed it on staffers. Pramila Jayapal did that a month or two back. Just suggesting that, fuel the proxy war and keep us at the brink of nuclear war, but maybe try a little diplomacy. That was too much. That was too much for official Washington. But so my point here is that it's down to the American people. We're the ones who are going to have to get in the streets and make these coalitions, as we see in Europe, and really focus on, pairing this anti-war movement with this anti-inflation sentiment that anybody can relate to, really. And that would help to unite, of course, the left, the right, the independents, and the libertarians. And frankly, we'd have to scare the hell out of Washington, is the line I use here at the end, a reference to I forget what his name, Senator Vandenberg, who told Harry Truman before he gave a speech inaugurating the Cold War, you got to scare the hell out of them. That's sort of a reference there. But yeah, I mean, and actually that appears to be happening. The People's Party and the Libertarian Party are organizing a march very similar to this with Jimmy Dore and Medea Benjamin and Scott Horton. And this will all be happening in D.C. here, I believe, on February 19th. And I think they want Roger Waters to headline. So that would be great. This is really a chance for us to have our voice heard. But I don't see any other option, unfortunately. But yeah, they're erasing red lines, and now I guess they won't see them when they cross them. So they just keep their fingers crossed. All right. Now we can move into this report I meant to mention earlier. Mitch McConnell actually just came out and said that his entire focus, the Republican Party, speaking for the senators, I guess, is that they want to see Russia defeated in Ukraine. And so, and of course, we know Liam McCollum, a great libertarian, pointed out on Twitter, of course, Avril Haines' testimony earlier in the war to the Senate Armed Services Committee, where she said that there's the cases in which potentially Vladimir Putin could use nukes or these tactical nuclear weapons or whatever would be if he felt, if they feel that the state, the Russian state or his regime is threatened, faces an existential threat, and this could come about if he perceives that he is losing the war. And Mitch McConnell seems to want to make sure that happens. And he said it was just great that we passed this bill. Even with a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House and a Democratic president, we can still come together to spend nearly well over almost $1 trillion, actually, just if you look at the Pentagon budget and this Ukraine aid. So anyway, all right, so now we're going to switch to Iran. This is a piece from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. This is from December 14th. IDF chief condemns Israeli airstrike, or confirms Israeli airstrike hit convoy on Syria-Iraq border in November. All right, so the head of the Israeli Defense Forces, this is Aviv Kohevi, on Wednesday confirmed that Tel Aviv was behind this airstrike on the Syria-Iraq border early last month, which targeted a truck convoy and reportedly killed at least 10 people. So Kohevi claimed that the truck in the convoy was carrying weapons from Iran to Lebanon, while Syrian reports say that they were carrying fuel. For their part, Hezbollah has denied that they had anything to do with these trucks that were targeted. And given that Tel Aviv bombs Syria on a weekly basis but rarely takes credit for individual strikes, it's not really clear why Kohevi admitted to this airstrike. He also claimed that Israeli intelligence capabilities helped locate which truck to hit. Quote, "We needed to send pilots to the right place, and they had to evade surface-to-air missiles fired at them. They needed to attack, they needed to hit their targets and come back safely and not kill people who shouldn't be killed. These are very advanced capabilities." The Wall Street Journal reported at the time that the strike had destroyed 2 fuel tankers shortly after they entered Syria and killed 10 people, including an unknown number of Iranians. The UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights put the casualty figure higher, saying 15 people were killed and described them as mostly pro-Iranian fighters. One recent Israeli airstrike in Syria took place earlier this month in the southern part of the country and reportedly targeted a Syrian military radar system. Hours after the strike, the IDF dropped threatening leaflets in the area, warning the Syrian military against cooperation with Hezbollah. And there was another recent strike I believe on Monday this week. Israel bombed some areas outside Damascus. And of course, they've attacked tankers carrying oil going to Syria for years now. The Israelis have. We've covered the Wall Street Journal reports about this, where I think within a year there were more than a dozen of such attacks from 2019 to maybe early 2021 or late 2019 to early 21. And it's just absolutely devastating. Obviously, the United States occupies a third of the country, steals their oil and their wheat, while 90% of the Syrian people live in absolute poverty with limited access to water, fuel, to food. And of course, like I said, Israel bombs the country every week, and we have these crippling sanctions on the country to make sure they can never rebuild until Assad is overthrown, which isn't going to happen. So it's just a permanent starvation campaign. All right, now this next one is from Dave DeCamp on December 18th. CIA chief says Russia and Iran building full-fledged defense partnership. Now, CIA Director William Burns said in an interview with PBS that Russia and Iran are working toward a, quote, full-fledged defense partnership, and that such an arrangement threatens the U.S. and its allies in the Middle East. As an example of Russian and Iranian military cooperation, Burns cited Iran supplying Russia with drones, although Tehran insists that only happened before Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. Burns said, quote, "The Russians are beginning to look at ways in which technologically or technically they can support the Iranians, which poses real threats to Iran's own neighborhood, to many of our friends and partners in Iran's neighborhood as well." Tehran subsequently dismissed Burns' concerns and said that it wouldn't seek permission from anyone before it expands ties with Russia. Nasser Kanani, the foreign ministry spokesman for Iran, said cooperation between Iran and Russia in various fields, including defense, is expanding within the framework of common interests and is not against any third country. Kanani also accused the U.S. of making baseless political claims about Iran and said such accusations are part of Washington's propaganda war against the Islamic Republic. It is pretty rich. Burns, the director of the CIA, threatening that things are going to get really bad in the Middle East if Russia and Iran continue to cooperate militarily, considering they helped wipe out for all intents and purposes, the Islamic State, which was built up out of Operation Timber Sycamore, the CIA's dirty war against Assad, where they funneled billions in dollars of weapons to Al-Qaeda and their affiliates in the country, and got 500,000 people killed. Now, so Kanani said American officials continue their baseless political claims, and illegal actions against the Islamic Republic of Iran, questioning the conventional defense and military cooperation between Iran and Russia. While the U.S. warns of the growing relationship between Russia and Iran, their stronger ties are the natural result of the U.S. targeting both countries with sanctions. And Dave is making this point here, but U.S. and other Western pressure against China has also brought Beijing and Moscow closer together, which includes more military cooperation, although China recently reaffirmed it wouldn't provide arms to aid in the Russian war effort. And we do know that Iran claims that they did not intend for their drones to be used in the war in Ukraine, that these sales were conducted, these transactions took place before the war started, and they've offered to basically work something out with the Ukrainians to find out what's going on. Are those our drones being used to bomb Ukrainians and civilian infrastructure, etc. And there was almost a meeting in a third country in Europe between a delegation from Tehran and then some Ukrainian officials, but the Americans and the Germans made sure that didn't happen. And of course, it's interesting because Iran has played an important role during the war, at least up until the last few months, where they actually were acting as a go-between between Moscow and Kiev and had a decent relationship with Ukraine as well as Russia, and were able to communicate messages back and forth, and that sort of culminated in them presenting a potential peace plan drawn up by a prominent Western leader who's rumored to be the French president, Emmanuel Macron. All right, now, this one, we already really knew this, but here's some confirmation. Biden says Iran deal is dead in newly surfaced video. And this is from Dave DeCamp on December 20th. So President Biden said that the Iran nuclear deal was dead in a video that was taken in early November and surfaced online this week. Biden made the comments on November 4th while he was on the sidelines of an election rally in California. He was asked by a woman if he could announce that the JCPOA is dead, to which Biden replies, "It is dead, but we're not going to announce it. Long story." Biden administration officials have made clear in recent months that reviewing the JCPOA was no longer a priority, but the president's comments are the surest sign that the accord won't be revived. A White House National Security Council spokesman told Axios on Tuesday that the JCPOA is, quote, "not our focus right now. It's not on the agenda." And we've heard from senior White House officials previously in Axios where they were saying that even if Iran came back to the table, we'd still tell them to, forget it, basically. Like, there's not going to be a deal. And our focus is on, even if they were to make concessions now, there's no way it would happen. We have no interest in that anymore. That's over. And we're preparing a military option. And our focus is, in the interim, on supporting the protesters and also basically, I guess, sanctioning Iran more for their supposed military cooperation with Russia in Ukraine. So now we also have so since negotiations between the U.S., this is Dave again, since negotiations between the U.S. and Iran broke down over the summer, the U.S. has increased sanctions on Iran and expressed support for protesters inside the country. As a candidate, Biden vowed to return to the JCPOA, and Iran made clear that it was ready to bring its nuclear program back into the restrictions set by the agreement if the U.S. lifted all Trump-era sanctions. Of course, Biden refused to lift sanctions and instead waited months to enter in direct negotiations with Iran. Biden had a chance to revive the JCPOA during negotiations even in 2021, during the, back when the so-called moderates were still in power with President Hassan Rouhani, the same government that negotiated the original JCPOA with Barack Obama's administration. This is a famous report from Trita Parsi, very critical, from Responsible Statecraft, which we covered last year. But he was talking about how in May, the Iranians came to Biden's men and said, okay, so if we return to compliance, and we, bring our nuclear program back into compliance to the letter of the deal, can you guarantee that you'll stay in the deal so long as we are compliant for the duration of your term? We know we can't trust the Republicans if you lose your next election, but can you guarantee us at least that we can get some cushioning here to make some economic arrangements before sanctions are reimposed again, once the next GOP candidate takes the Oval Office? And Biden's men told him no. So by failing to revive the JCPOA and increasing sanctions on Iran, Biden has continued the maximum pressure campaign of Donald Trump. The policy really hasn't changed ever since Biden first sent those B-52 over the Persian Gulf as soon as he came into office. All right, this is from Dave DeCamp, December 21st. U.S. sanctions prevent dozens of ships carrying food from reaching Iran. Dozens of merchant ships carrying grain and sugar are stuck outside Iranian ports due to payment issues as a result of Western sanctions. This is from a Reuters report on Wednesday. Now, while the U.S. and other Western sanctions technically have exemptions for food and other humanitarian goods, as we've covered before, in the case of, for instance, Russian grain and fertilizer, the Reuters report said, quote, the impact of sanctions on Iran's financial system have created complex and erratic payment arrangements with international companies. The payment issues have left 40 ships stuck outside Iranian ports, which are estimated to be holding about $1 billion worth of cargo. Iran's ports and maritime organizations said in November that the ships off Iran were unable to unload due to, quote, documentation of hard currency payment issues. Now, Elena Duhan, a UN special rapporteur, issued a report in September detailing how the U.S. and other Western sanctions harm Iranians. She said, since the sanctions were reimposed after Trump illegally and unilaterally left the JCPOA in May of 2018, food insecurity has soared, her words, in Iran, reaching 60% in certain areas. She also said that the sanctions have severely undermined the delivery of medicine and medical goods to Iran. She said the licenses that are supposed to be issued by the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control to ensure exemptions appear to be ineffective and nearly non-existent. There's no sign that U.S. sanctions on Iran will be lifted anytime soon, as, of course, we heard from Biden here in this November campaign rally. And, of course, I know the U.S. Just imposed more sanctions this week on Iranian officials regarding this, their suppression of the protest movement. And so just, again, they're under so many sanctions at this point that it's more or less symbolic. But nevertheless, it doesn't appear that that Biden's administration will ever return to diplomacy with Iran. That said, I'll end with this last story from Al Jazeera. So this is, I'm just going to read some important bits from this. This is from earlier in the week. Iran and EU signal continued work on nuclear deal in Jordan. Okay, so the top foreign policy representatives of Iran and the European Union have signaled that efforts to restore the country's 2015 nuclear deal will continue after they held a meeting in Jordan. So Iran's foreign minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian and Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, who really was the guy who was putting together the final proposal that really did try to make the right concessions on both sides, and ultimately the Americans, once all these, David Barnea, the head of the Mossad, and Benny Gantz, and all these congressional hawks in both parties launched their full court PR press, made sure that even if Biden had even an inkling of a willingness to return to the deal, made sure that he didn't. But now we have Hossein Amir Abdollahian meeting with Joseph Borrell on the sidelines of the second meeting of the Baghdad Conference for Cooperation and Partnership hosted by King Abdullah on Tuesday. Now, Iran's top negotiator in the talks, Ali Bagheri Khani, and Enrique Mora, the nuclear coordinator for the talks for the EU, was also present. Borrell said on Twitter following the meeting that it was necessary to talk amid deteriorating Iran and EU relations, and stressed the need to stop military support to Russia and internal repression in Iran. He wrote, adding that the two sides agreed to keep talking with the aim of restoring the JCPOA. So the protests that erupted in September and the new sanctions the EU and the U.S. have imposed since over the suppression of protesters, in addition to those leveled to punish them for the alleged supply of drones to Russia for its war in Ukraine, have made prospects of actual progress unlikely. However, Borrell said earlier this month that issues of protests and Ukraine need to be separated from the nuclear deal, as the bloc does, quote, not have a better option than the JCPOA to ensure that Iran does not develop nuclear weapons. I suspect that this is because they're not really concerned. Maybe they are. I don't believe it, but I think they want to lower energy prices, obviously. Now, which could actually work we thought it might work in our favor months ago. But now, after Tuesday's meeting in Jordan, the Iranian Foreign Ministry said Amir Abdollahian told Borrell Iran is ready to finalize the nuclear talks, quote, based on a draft that is the result of months of difficult and intensive negotiations. Although unconfirmed, this appears to be the August draft presented by the EU, based on which Tehran and Washington had some initial constructive back and forth, but ultimately faced a deadlock after they accused each other of demanding too much. Now, there has been no sign of any serious movement on the IAEA probe into these undeclared nuclear sites where there were these unprocessed particles of uranium that are no proliferation risk. But we've talked before about how this is just an issue that is brought up by the Americans and the Israelis to basically thwart any kind of diplomacy. But there is a delegation by the IAEA led by Deputy Director Massimo Aparo, who's in Tehran this weekend. He held meetings with Mohammad Eslami, the Iranian nuclear chief, and as well as officials from the foreign ministry. So, but there's no details yet disclosed from either side about that meeting. And then the last thing is that after a meeting with Borrell on Tuesday, Hossein Amir Abdollahian, the foreign minister from Iran, met with the foreign minister of Oman, who has previously relayed many messages between Tehran and Washington on the nuclear deal. So I doubt there's going to be any success that comes out of that, but it's worth noting. We may see some more developments here in a bit, but I wouldn't hold my breath.
All right, Connor, thank you so much. And we will have more shows for you guys next week. Everybody have a good Christmas weekend, and the show will be back next week. Thanks, Connor.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everybody.